200 Comanche braves don't simply materialize at your homestead by mere chance or coincidence. They arrive seeking bloody vengeance, demanding righteous satisfaction, or preparing for devastating warfare. Thaddeus Bear Mallister was moments away from discovering their true and deadly purpose. However, this tale must begin where everything initially commenced and started. 24 hours previously, the absolutely merciless Texas sun was blazing down without any mercy whatsoever upon Bear's sprawling cattle ranch situated somewhere between the bustling town of Amarillo and the vast, endless emptiness of nowhere, when he initially observed and spotted the small, struggling silhouette stumbling desperately across his extensive territory and property. At 34 years of age, Bear had witnessed and experienced considerable hardship, trouble, and adversity during his many years spent managing and working cattle and livestock. Yet something significant regarding this particular morning carried a distinctly different quality and atmosphere, an ominous, foreboding sensation, even. He was working diligently to repair and fix a badly damaged fence post positioned near the flowing water source, when sudden movement seized and captured his immediate attention. A youngster, appearing to be no older than 8 or 9 years of age, was advancing and moving forward in unsteady, wavering, zigzagging patterns directly toward his creek and water supply. The child's garments and clothing were severely ripped and torn, traditional Native American attire and dress that had clearly and obviously experienced much better days and times. Even from his distant position and vantage point, Bear could easily observe and notice how severe starvation and hunger made each individual footstep a tremendous and overwhelming struggle for survival. The vast majority of cattle ranchers and livestock owners throughout these harsh and unforgiving regions would have immediately and without hesitation reached for their loaded firearms first and demanded detailed explanations and answers afterward. The complex relationship existing between white settlers and colonists and the local Comanche tribal communities and bands had remained extremely tense, strained, and volatile for numerous years and decades, with violent raids and brutal counter-raids keeping absolutely everyone constantly on high alert and perpetually vigilant. However, Bear had consistently and always been different from his neighboring ranchers and settlers, perhaps far too different for his own personal safety, security, and well-being. He carefully and deliberately set down his working tools and equipment and began walking slowly and cautiously in the direction of the mysterious child, ensuring his hands remained completely visible and his movements were deliberate, measured, and non-threatening in every possible way. As he drew closer and nearer to the small figure, he could clearly and distinctly see it was a young girl, her dark, expressive eyes appearing unnaturally large and prominent for her severely thin and gaunt face, her lips cracked, split, and damaged from severe dehydration and lack of water. She gazed upward at him with a complex expression combining raw fear and desperate desperation that struck him with the tremendous force of a physical punch delivered directly to his stomach and gut. The girl spoke rapidly and urgently in the Comanche language and dialect, using words and phrases he couldn't possibly understand or comprehend. But her meaning and intent were abundantly clear and unmistakable nonetheless. She was slowly starving to death, quite possibly and very likely hadn't consumed any food or sustenance whatsoever for several long days. Her small, delicate, trembling hands gestured repeatedly and frantically toward her mouth and lips, then pointed directly toward the flowing creek and water source, employing a universal language of desperate need and survival that successfully transcended any existing cultural barriers and differences between them. Bear found himself thinking deeply about his neighboring ranchers and settlers, contemplating and considering what their immediate reaction and response would be if they discovered and learned about him providing assistance and aid to a Comanche child. He carefully considered the numerous warnings and cautions he'd received while visiting town regarding recent escalating tensions and conflicts with the various tribal communities and groups. He thought carefully and thoroughly about the intelligent, smart thing to do, the safe, cautious, and prudent course of action that would protect and safeguard him from potential danger and harm. Then he looked directly and intensely into those desperately pleading and begging eyes once again and reached the fateful, life-changing decision that would completely and utterly change everything in his life forever and for all time. Without uttering a single word or sound, Bear carefully and gently scooped the girl up into his strong, capable arms. She weighed practically nothing at all, feeling almost weightless, and he carried her steadily and securely toward his modest, humble cabin and dwelling. She didn't attempt to resist his help or assistance, far too weak and exhausted to fight back or struggle even if she had possessed the desire or strength to do so. As he walked carefully across his property and land, he could distinctly feel her tiny, fragile body trembling and shaking continuously and persistently. Whether the shaking and trembling resulted from terror and fear, or hunger and starvation, or perhaps both combined together, he couldn't accurately determine or figure out. Inside his humble, modest, and simple cabin, Bear gently and carefully placed her down on his only available chair and moved quickly and efficiently to prepare nourishing, sustaining food. He possessed some remaining stew and broth left over from the previous evening, still maintaining adequate warmth on his reliable wood-burning stove, along with fresh, warm bread he had personally baked and prepared during that same morning. The rich, appetizing, and enticing smell and aroma of the prepared food seemed to somewhat revive and restore the girl, and for the very first time since their encounter, he witnessed something that might possibly have been hope and optimism flickering briefly and momentarily within her dark, expressive eyes. As he carefully and methodically ladled the warm, nourishing stew into a clean, available bowl, Bear suddenly caught sight of something specific that made his blood run completely cold throughout his entire body and being. Around the girl's slender, delicate neck, partially concealed and hidden by her torn and severely damaged clothing and garments, was a highly distinctive and recognizable necklace featuring intricate, elaborate beadwork and specific patterns and designs he had definitely and certainly seen before on previous occasions. His elderly neighbor and friend, old Pete Morrison, had described and detailed those exact same patterns and designs to him just the previous week during a casual conversation and discussion. They represented and symbolized the ceremonial beads traditionally worn by the immediate family members and relatives of Chief White Bull, widely recognized and acknowledged as the most powerful, influential, and feared Comanche leader throughout the entire region and territory. Bear's hand froze completely motionless and still, halfway through the motion of handing her the bowl of warm, nourishing stew. If this particular girl was indeed who he now suspected and believed her to be, he wasn't simply providing assistance and aid to a hungry and desperate child in need. He was actually harboring, sheltering, and protecting the beloved, precious daughter of the man who could effortlessly and easily bring 200 fierce, skilled warriors down upon his head without even breaking a sweat or experiencing the slightest difficulty or challenge. However, it was far too late to alter, change, or modify his chosen course of action now. The girl was already reaching eagerly toward the food with her small, delicate, shaking hands, and Bear found himself completely unable to summon the heart, courage, or resolve necessary to turn her away from his door and property. He handed her the bowl of warm stew and watched intently and carefully as she consumed it with the desperate, frantic hunger and appetite characteristic and typical of someone who hadn't seen any food or sustenance whatsoever for multiple long days and nights. What Bear remained completely unaware and ignorant of was that approximately 20 miles away from his ranch property, a large Comanche search party and group had just successfully discovered and found the girl's clear, obvious trail leading directly and unmistakably toward his property and homestead, and Chief White Bull himself was personally riding and leading at the head of that particular party and group. His weathered, experienced face displayed and showed a mask of pure fury, rage, and profound grief and sorrow that promised absolutely nothing except serious trouble, danger, and potentially deadly consequences for whoever had dared to take, capture, or harm his precious, beloved daughter. The girl finished consuming her meal completely and entirely and looked up at Bear with something that might possibly have been genuine gratitude, appreciation, and thankfulness. However, as the afternoon shadows began steadily lengthening and stretching across his property and land, Bear couldn't manage to shake or dismiss the persistent, nagging feeling that he had just made either the absolute best decision of his entire life or the very last decision he would ever have the opportunity or chance to make. The exhausted girl fell into deep, peaceful sleep while sitting comfortably in Bear's chair within approximately 1 hour, with complete exhaustion finally overtaking and claiming her small, fragile body entirely. Bear covered her carefully and tenderly with his only available blanket, and covering and attempted earnestly to convince himself that he had done the morally right, correct, and proper thing. However, as evening steadily approached and darkness began to fall, that conviction and certainty began to crumble, deteriorate, and weaken significantly. The distinctive, unmistakable sound of multiple hoofbeats and horses on the dirt road leading to his property made his stomach drop and sink with overwhelming dread and apprehension. Bear peered cautiously and carefully through his small cabin window and observed his neighbor and friend, Cletus Hartwell, riding hard, fast, and urgently toward his cabin accompanied by 2 other men Bear easily recognized and knew from town, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison and the local preacher and minister, Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside his cabin before they could dismount from their horses, desperately hoping to keep their voices lowered and quiet and avoid waking and disturbing the peacefully sleeping girl inside. However, Cletus was already shouting and yelling loudly before his horse came to a complete stop. "Bear, you damn fool! What in the hell are you thinking about doing here?" Cletus's face was bright red and flushed with anger, fury, and something that distinctly looked and appeared like genuine fear and terror. Morrison here claims and says he observed smoke signals rising from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are actively searching and looking for something or someone specific and particular. Deputy Sheriff Morrison nodded with a grim, serious expression and demeanor. "My father sent urgent word and communication from town. Chief White Bull's daughter went missing and disappeared 3 full days ago during a hunting party expedition and journey. Word circulating and spreading is that she wandered off and became lost during a severe, violent storm." He paused deliberately and intentionally, studying Bear's face very carefully and intently. "You wouldn't happen to possess any knowledge or information about a missing Comanche girl, would you?" Bear felt his throat become completely dry and parched. The intelligent, smart thing would be to lie convincingly and effectively, to send them away and attempt to figure this dangerous, precarious situation out on his own. However, these men had been his neighbors, friends, and acquaintances for many long years. Despite their various flaws, shortcomings, and imperfections, they were present out of genuine concern and worry for his welfare and safety. "She's inside my cabin," Bear said quietly and softly, half-starved and completely exhausted. "I couldn't simply leave her outside to die and perish." The silence and quiet that immediately followed was absolutely deafening and overwhelming. Reverend Thomas was the first person to speak and respond, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "Son, do you possess any idea whatsoever about what you've accomplished and done here? I helped and assisted a hungry child in desperate need. Bear replied firmly and resolutely. However, even as he spoke those words and statements, he could clearly hear how naive, foolish, and innocent they sounded. Cletus began pacing back and forth nervously and anxiously, running his hands repeatedly and continuously through his hair. They're going to think and believe you deliberately took and captured her. Hell, they probably already believe and suspect that. White Bull has been known to completely wipe out and destroy entire settlements and communities for significantly less than this offense and transgression. Deputy Sheriff Morrison was already backing and retreating toward his horse. I have to report and communicate this situation and incident, Bear. It's my official duty and responsibility, but I'll provide you with a head start and advantage. Get her back to her people before they discover and find you here. In the complete darkness and night? Bear asked desperately and frantically. She can barely walk or move at all. And how exactly am I supposed to approach and near a Comanche camp without getting shot completely full of arrows and killed? That's your problem and challenge to solve now, Morrison said, mounting his horse. I'm riding immediately to town to warn and alert everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch alone. As the three men rode away into the growing darkness and night, Bear stood completely alone and isolated in the deepening shadows, listening to the girl's quiet, peaceful breathing from inside the cabin. He thought about saddling up his horse and trying to locate and find the Comanche camp, but he knew with absolute certainty it was suicide and death. He considered loading her into his wagon and trying to reach the nearest town, but that would only make the entire situation significantly worse and more dangerous. The harsh, brutal truth was there existed no good, favorable way out of this predicament and dilemma. Every available option and choice led to the same destination and outcome: a direct, inevitable confrontation with one of the most feared, respected war chiefs in all of Texas. As if his worried, anxious thoughts had somehow summoned and called him, a new, ominous sound drifted across the vast, endless plains. The distant, rhythmic beating of war drums steadily growing closer and louder with each passing minute. Bear's blood turned to ice and froze. They weren't waiting for morning light and dawn. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear rushed back into the cabin quickly and urgently, his mind racing frantically and desperately. The war drums were becoming louder and more intense, and he could now make out individual beats and rhythms within the complex pattern. Slow, methodical, deliberate, and absolutely terrifying and frightening. This wasn't the chaotic noise and sound typically associated with a raiding party or group. This was something far more organized, systematic, and infinitely more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered or experienced before in his entire life.